I do take seriously the idea that it's possible that we are indeed communicating with some kind of other intelligence, the location and the identity and the origin, the nature of which we have no idea about. So I take that seriously. So then the question arises as well, what do we do about that? DMT reliably grants us access to these intelligences, but it is very short acting. It's 5 minutes, in the space. You go up this roller coaster phase, you burst through this breakthrough phase into this strange, very strange domain with these intelligences, and then suddenly, maybe just a few minutes later, it might just be 3, 4, 5 minutes later, you're being dragged back out again. Just as the state is starting to stabilize and you're starting to perhaps establish communication with these entities, you're being dragged back out. So it's not conducive to establishing stable two-way communication with whatever beings are in there, for actually studying the space, studying these intelligences, developing some kind of relationship with these intelligences to really learn about who the fuck they are. Again, if you take these intelligences seriously and you want to establish communication with them, you want to understand them, you want to know where they're from and what's the relationship between us and them, you have to stop treating DMT like a drug. Treat it like a technology that you develop. It's kind of an important cognitive shift. Once you start treating DMT like a technology, then you think about, okay, what's the best way to use and develop this technology?
That's a crazy way to put it.
Yeah, but it's right, yeah? Because then you free yourself from the idea that this is a drug. And you think, okay, this is a technology for entering this alternate reality model, this alternate world filled with these beings. How do we develop this technology? How do we improve upon methods of administration and utilization of this molecule? That's the key cognitive switch. And so, that switch happened to me, and I thought, okay, let's think about how we can improve this technology. So DMT is a fascinating molecule for many reasons, not just in terms of its effects, but also it has these what I call pharmacological peculiarities. Unlike the other classic psychedelics, it's, as we said, very short acting, which is for most people merciful. Most people, 5-10 minutes in that space, quite enough. Thank you very much. Quite enough. But as I said, for extended journeying in that space, to give you more time to interact with these beings and study the space, to map the space, to look at the geometry and the topology and the dynamics of this space, you need more time. So how do we extend the time? Well, DMT, it's short acting. It doesn't seem to have subjective tolerance. It's completely non-toxic, it seems.
What do you mean? Can you expand on the subjective tolerance part of it?
Yeah, so Rick Strassman, of course, did the largest study of DMT in humans in the 90s. He was jumping through a lot of fucking hoops to do this work. No one was doing this work before him, with the end of the psychedelic dark ages in a way, and certainly in terms of academic study in humans, no one was doing it. So he had to go through, a lot of bureaucracy and permits and licenses and convincing the relevant authorities that they should allow him to do this study with DMT. And he made it as boring as possible. His proposal, I'm going to measure blood pressure, I'm going to measure skin conductance, I'm going to measure heart rate. It's like,
didn't he do it for schizophrenia? And didn't he get the funding from the war on drugs or something?
He got, I can't tell you where he got the funding from, but it wouldn't surprise me, right? That they might fund something as dull, and uninteresting as that. But of course, what came out of it was all these trip reports, and became part of his book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule. So that was the real purpose of this study. But of course, he didn't tell them.
Genius.
Oh yeah, absolute genius. But one of the, as well as simply, so he had 60 volunteers. He injected them with bolus DMT, which means the injection all in at once or within 30 seconds. So a normal DMT trip, basically, they go into the space, they're there for a few minutes, and they come back out again. Standard stuff. But one study that he did was to look at the subjective tolerance. So if you take something like LSD, if you take LSD on day one, and have your your LSD trip, let's say 100 micrograms. If you take the same dose the next day, you will have a much more kind of diminished experience. So there's subjective tolerance there. And there's a number of mechanisms that's going on in the brain why that's the case, but that's what you see. It's
like a tolerance.
Yeah, exactly. A tolerance. The reason we say subjective tolerance is tolerance to the effects. When you measure the intensity of the effects in the individual, they are diminished over time. Now, Rick Strassman wanted to test whether that was still the case with DMT. So if he injected someone with DMT, and then he measured the intensity of the effects using his hallucinogen rating scale, and then injected them again 30 minutes later, what is the intensity of the effects? Does it go down? And he found that it didn't. It didn't go down. The intensity of the effects remained the same no matter how many times he injected them with DMT, which is kind of fascinating. But what that, in itself, it's an interesting scientific result, and it's another one of these interesting pharmacological peculiarities of DMT. Is it has this particular characteristic, but to me, this suggested that DMT could be utilized not by bolus injection, but you could actually infuse DMT into someone's bloodstream and actually maintain a stable brain DMT concentration. And the intensity of the subjective effects would remain constant because there's no subjective tolerance. Yes, and also because it's so rapidly metabolized and removed from the brain, it doesn't build up either. Yeah, so this technology is called target controlled intravenous infusion, TCIV, and it's well established as a technology that's been used for decades in anesthesiology. Okay. So in anesthesiology, if you want to put somebody under general anesthetic, what they don't do is kind of inject you with the anesthetic and then kind of put you to sleep, because the anesthetic will rise in the brain and then it will begin to fall. So they would go to sleep, they would become unconscious, and then they would start to come out. That's no good if you want to hold someone unconscious for several hours. So what you do instead is you take a very short-acting anesthetic drug with no subjective tolerance, so that won't have diminished effects over time, and you infuse it. You develop what's called a pharmacokinetic model, which is a mathematical model of the metabolism, the distribution, the absorption, the excretion of the drug over time, which allows you to program this infusion device such that you can maintain a stable brain anesthetic drug concentration. You can push them deeper. You can bring them into a more shallow anesthetized state. You can have really quite good control. So this is well-established technology in anesthesiology. And my thought was, well, let's repurpose that. Let's replace the anesthetic drug with DMT. We can develop a mathematical model, the same pharmacokinetic model that's been used for anesthetics, but create it with using the data from DMT. And I knew Rick Strassman had that data. He published he was measuring the blood levels of DMT over time. So he had a model, of the absorption and the rise of DMT in the bloodstream and then the subsequent drop-off. So I knew he had that data, and that's the data you need to build this pharmacokinetic model. So I thought, okay, this is cool. This would be a technology for extending the DMT state from 5 minutes to however long you want, an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, an unlimited, really, amount of time within certain practical considerations required. So I sent an email to Rick and said, hey, do you still have this data from back in the 90s? This was in 2015. Fortunately, he hadn't, unlike some scientists would have done, kind of discarded or lost the data. So he had this old Excel file, which he fired back to me after about 30 minutes. And I thought, yeah, here we go. So we agreed at this point, to kind of write this paper, to propose this technology. I would do the modeling, build this pharmacokinetic model, and then we would get together, we would write the paper and explain why this technology could be useful for extending the DMT state. And then we managed to get it published relatively easily. The first journal we went to published the paper for us. And this was just a proof of principle model. It was basically to say, look, this technology should work. Yeah? It wasn't a technology, here's sirens.
That's okay.
It wasn't a technology or a model that was ready to be deployed in humans straight away. We just wanted to show that, hey, DMT has the right pharmacological properties that would make it amenable to this kind of technology. And when the paper was published, it got quite a lot of attention. People were writing articles about, these scientists are building machines to communicate with aliens. A lot of kind of hyperbole.
It's a good clickbait headline.
Absolutely, yeah. And so for that reason, many people still think that I am injecting people with DMT. No, that was never the aim, that I would be kind of running these studies. All I wanted to do was plant that seed in the scientific consciousness, so to speak, and get people to notice it and to pick it up. And they did. So the Imperial College team were, certainly of the academic institutions, were the first to really run with this idea. And they improved upon the model. The model I produced wasn't by any stretch of the imagination a perfect model. It wasn't ready to go into humans. It was a back-of-the-envelope kind of model, proof of principle model. So the Imperial team spent time recruiting, pharmacokineticists, pharmacologists to actually get a really good model ready that would allow them to do this in humans. And they were successful, and they recruited maybe 2 or 3 years ago, they recruited a small number of volunteers for a pilot project. I think there was 11 people in this pilot study, and were successful. They published this paper very recently in the last few months, and demonstrated that it works. They can stabilize this DMT state in this study for 30 minutes. 30 minutes, and it was tolerable. These people weren't freaking out. They weren't going mad. Their anxiety levels peaked at the start of the experience and then settled back down to kind of pre-dose levels, right? So these were very comfortable in the space. Their heart rate, again, same deal, blood pressure, etc. They were dealing with it very well. They were experienced DMT users, by the way. You didn't pull people from the street who've never taken DMT before and say, hey, let me infuse you. Nothing like that. That would be absurd, of course. But yeah, it was completely safe, completely tolerable. There's a group in Basel now, in Switzerland, who have extended it to 90 minutes. And they just published their paper on this. And again, able to stabilize the experience for 90 minutes at several dose levels. So you can have a light experience, or you can push it right through to kind of breakthrough levels. The same kind of level brain concentration as you would get by taking, a couple of lungfuls of pure DMT vapor. So real proper DMT, serious DMT experiences, but extended and controllable in real time.